أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum, dear audience and dear guests. Welcome to another episode of Building the Virtuous Community, where we discuss and talk about what are those aspects that are pertinent to build a strong and vibrant community throughout Europe, throughout North America, and throughout the world. We've been discussing a slew of different topics, ranging from spirituality in the first week, then going on to leadership. And then last week we talked about media engagement and had a very vibrant discussion there. We got a lot of questions, and unfortunately we weren't able to get to all of them in depth. However, we're going to make a lot of time for questions this evening, inshallah. We have a very important topic of discussion that is pivotal to the growth of any community to make it vibrant. And we have an excellent panel to discuss this at the highest level. In Islam, as you know, this idea of education has been part and parcel from the very beginning and the very inception. Therefore, we're going to be looking and tackling some of the biggest issues related to this on an individual level of how education and development are tied together as an individual for you, the audience, as well as at a community level. How important is education in fostering, spurring, and building and developing a strong and vibrant community? Having said that, before we go into a little bit of an overview of what we're actually fully going to be discussing in depth, I want to introduce our panel and welcome them and thanking them for joining us. First, I'd like to welcome someone who has dedicated their life to education for themselves as well as for others and helping to facilitate it. Haja, Nawal, Hamadeh, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much. And I'd also like to welcome someone who's very known to our community as well. And for those who may not be aware, the one and all alike, the Professor Dr. Sajad Rizvi from the University of Exeter, who's dedicated his life to Islam and also the aspects of history, educational development, and many other things. By the way, I'd like to invite our audience. I remind you that we have detailed the bios of the respected guests, and I invite you to read those on the link that has been that your community may have forwarded to you, so you get more depth about where they are. Professor Rizvi, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for joining us.
Alaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
We're really excited about having a very vibrant discussion here. Just to get started, the first verse of Revelation, we're told, is the word Iqra, or read, from the first element of the establishment of Islam. We have traditions where we're told that if there was a POW or a prisoner of war, that the Prophet would allow them to go free if they were to simply teach certain people to read and write. We have tradition after tradition that highlights this. We have verses of the Quran that, for example, highlight the importance of knowledge and reflection, tafakkur and tadabbur. We have the traditions that say, for example, utlub al-ilm min al-mahdi ila al-lahad, obtain knowledge from the cradle to the grave. We have hadiths that tell us to even go far and travel. We have traditions that say, for example, that obtaining knowledge is a obligation on every male and female. And it's come in both ways, we've seen. Muslim or Muslima, or Muslim in the context of man, which includes both genders. So all of these things. In fact, there's another tradition that highlights this idea that one should obtain knowledge from wherever they get it, regardless of the source. That is, that knowledge is the lost property of a mu'min, the lost property of a believer. I remember one time I was lecturing on this topic, and at the forefront, I had read an article in preparation for it that was highlighting that there was a publication that was in one of the Middle Eastern countries that was around knowledge. And it had some calligraphy and artwork on the cover of this. And on the cover of this publication, now the editor of this publication had the artwork on the wall behind him. And a German researcher had visited him. And when he visited his office, he said, "Could you explain this artwork, this calligraphy that's on your wall?" He said, "Yes." So he said, right in the middle of it is the first verse of Revelation. He said, "Oh, okay, what is that?" He said, "The first verse of Revelation is Iqra. It's the word, one component of that. Read." He said, wow, that's interesting. What are the four corners here? He said, well, in each of the four corners, there's an attributed prophetic tradition that's attributed to the Holy Prophet. He said, well, what are they? Could you go walk me through them? He said, well, yeah. Well, one of them says that, for example, it says obtain knowledge even if you have to go to China. Now, there's different scholarly interpretations of that. We'll leave that to the side for the moment, but this is what the artwork had on it. Then he said, well, that's very interesting. So it doesn't depend on the space in which you exist. Wherever it is, you go and get knowledge. Yep. He said, very interesting. He said, what else does it say? Well, it says, طلب العلم فريضة على كل مسلم, that obtaining knowledge is an obligation on every Muslim. He said, wow, it's an obligation. It's a part of your faith. He said, yes, indeed it is. And then he continues on and he says, what's the third corner? He says, the third corner here says, it says that one should obtain knowledge from the cradle to the grave. He said, wow, from min al-mahdi ila al-lahad. So he said, wow. So it's not bound by space because you have to go wherever you have to go in order to get it, number one. And number two, it's not bound by the time, meaning it's not bound by zaman and makan. It's not bound by the time and space. At every moment, one should be obtaining knowledge. And he says, what's the fourth corner? So, well, the fourth corner, interestingly, says that one should obtain knowledge no matter what the source. That knowledge is the lost property of an individual. And so according to this story that we're told, this German researcher responded, well, I'm baffled and astonished that the Muslim community is not leading the world in terms of its educational development, knowledge, and so on and so forth. That part and parcel of the Islamic tradition are all of these elements. So what we're going to be discussing, and as I turn to my panelists here, is, well, how important is education truly? What do we mean when we say education? It may mean very different things in different minds. Is it just going to school? Well, if you're going to school, what are you learning at school? Are you talking about STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, math? Are we talking about creativity-based subjects? Because one modern critique that has come forward with education is creativity is not being taught. So these are other elements. We're also going to get eventually into the topic of, well, should we be focusing on Islamic schools or non-Islamic schools? Or can we actually be part of the narrative of improving schools and making, for example, if it's a secular school, how can we foster the holistic education of a student? Also, what is the history of Islamic education? How does Islam look at the concept of education? Does it follow the typical pattern that we're used to in the West, in Europe and in North America, or does it have a different paradigm? If it does have a different paradigm, well, what is that paradigm? And we're going to be getting into a lot of these things to understand also ultimately the style of education and the method of education and the systems of education that you and I adopt living in America or Canada or in England. Well, where did those come from? And also, why is there one particular system that many people are now coming forward and saying is inadequate? Another question we'll look at is, for example, why is it that there's a one-size-fits-all system? We seem to see this in our world. Many people may have different other aspects. And another question we'll try to look at is, well, what should I do with my life? Should I do what the drift of my society is telling me to do, to become a doctor, an engineer, a lawyer? Or is it possible that I have a gift that God has given me, that Allah has given me, that is unique, that others may not have to the caliber in which I may have it? These are just some of the questions. And of course, we will be getting to your questions as well. And we look forward to those. You can drop those to us and we will address that with the respective panelists. I've said a lot here. I'm going to turn to Haja Nawal and start the first question, if I may, about this idea of how important is education truly? You know, this term is thrown around a lot. You know, people think about, you know, where are they going to move? Where are they going to live to have the best schools for their children, the best universities for their children? And at the same time, it sometimes becomes abstract. So I was wondering if you could shed some light on how important is education truly? Haja Nawal, please.
First, salam alaikum, my apology. Initially, I couldn't say that. My microphone was off. Education is definitely very important for many, many reasons. And Islam has stressed that in the Holy Quran, as you expressed, and also throughout the different hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, may peace be upon him. Understanding education is important before we can go as to why it's important. Of course, education is the procedure of acquiring skills and knowledge and the values. It's not just reading and writing. So education is multiple things. So it's acquiring habits, acquiring beliefs through reading, writing, experimenting, and the experience in life. That gives us education as well. Many people misunderstand what education is, thinking it's about reading, going to school and reading and writing alone. It's beyond that. When we do research, when we really, like especially now with the coronavirus, in-depth research helps us understand. Basically, it gets us into a deeper level of knowledge. The more we learn, the more we find out how less we know, how little we know. And so it helps us go to a higher level, a deeper level of inquiry and knowledge. And so why do we need education? What's the importance of education? Education is enlightening. So it starts from the early on as children, and then we expand on the knowledge. You know, we go through the basic necessities in life, as in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as an example. We begin with our basic physiological needs, and then we move on to the safety, the love, belonging, and then the esteem. And then the higher the knowledge is, the more we move to the higher level, the self-actualization. And then we can talk about that later on if there's time. So as far as the importance of education, so what do we accomplish out of it? So in education, when we become aware, when we are knowledgeable, we're able to defend ourselves. We are able to remove the prejudice from around us, and then it cleanses our minds as well, because sometimes we may have certain concepts about certain cultures, certain people. We become aware of what they're all about. So it provides a broader level of understanding, brings people more to a mutual understanding than to base it on ignorance. So education removes ignorance from the picture, and it positions us as individuals and also as a community in a much a much more respectful level. People will tend to respect us, to listen to us more, especially when we base our education or our conversations on not just reading and writing. It's on facts. When we use facts, we use those in-depth information that people, it makes sense. It gives common sense to the other people. And it also helps us, from economical perspective in finding positions. It gives us that level of security, level of independence. It really helps us in, disciplining our mind as well, in developing spontaneous, developing free spontaneous expressions where we become listened to. So instead of ignored. In business, as an example, when we are knowledgeable, when we read contracts, it prevents us from making mistakes and committing to contracts that will lead us to hardships and unnecessary liabilities and so forth. These are examples. And education also helps in the practice of the moral and intellectual, in acquiring the moral and intellectual virtues. When education is well-rounded, as an example, then we have the values and the ethics that are embedded in there that will prevent us from using that education in the wrong way, because education alone without building the character can really be misleading and can be destructive to humankind and to the self as well. So we have to be careful as to what education we seek, what education we accomplish and we acquire and so forth. And just reading and writing doesn't necessarily make us well informed, because in looking at the media as an example, you hear a lot of stories and they give you different details. So it tends to kind of sway the mindset in a different direction, the way they would want you to think. So by having diverse education, we're exposed to a knowledge that is more likely to be more reasonable than to just learn one way and believe in one way. So we learn to know what the truth is as well. By having that well-rounded education, your brains become more equipped in identifying right from wrong, in identifying facts from myths, and in identifying real situation than made up stories and lies and so forth. So education is enlightening. It's the nur that is really instilled in us as God had wished us to be knowledgeable. And this is why the first word that came upon the Prophet ﷺ, read. It starts with that, and it ends, and it never ends. And we are, for us, we are made to continue to grow mentally, though physically we may kind of stop the growth, from getting taller and bigger and so forth, but mentally there are no limits as to how much we can learn and grow. And it's on us, and it's up to us as to how much we continue to grow. And this ongoing knowledge never ends. It is really required, in my opinion, so we can reach our maximum potential and we fulfill our goals in life, and also we fulfill the mission and vision that God had put for us in life, why we were born. We were born naturally for a reason. It is to serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and not just to think of worldly and materialistic things. These are only tools to help us accomplish what we need to accomplish. But beyond that, there's a higher goal, and that is to serve God in many ways, not just necessarily to just pray. By us maximizing our potential, we really fulfill that mission. That means we are serving Allah through serving others. We're serving by passing on the knowledge to others as well. We're serving by instilling the education and the values in our children. We're also contributing to the community. We're also contributing to the bigger community, not necessarily the immediate community, but even to the world as well. That knowledge is needed in order to make the world a much better place to live in, a more peaceful place to live in. While the knowledge that's not well-rounded could be destructive. I don't want to take too much time, and I'm sure the brothers would like to also contribute to that conversation. Thank you.
No, very, very well stated, as this idea of education being a way of actualizing or self-actualizing our ability and our potential, and ultimately enlightening ourselves to be able to get further. And also highlighting the idea of critical analysis, the ability to actually assess what is truth, what is right, what is wrong, to not just simply absorb. And that's the Quranic verses really highlight to this idea. هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة وإن كانوا من قبل لفي ضلال مبين. This idea that that verily they were in manifest darkness before, and taking them into a light. So that idea of enlightenment really coming forward, even in the Quranic context. I'm reminded, as I turn to Professor Rizvi, of the allegory of the cave by Plato. And this idea of moving from a society where you imagine you're in a cave and you're with your cave mates, and you break free, and then you leave the cave and you see reality, and then you come back to the cave, and your mates don't believe what's outside. They think you've lost your mind. And so education may have this idea of bringing us to the light, but there's also the argument of ignorance is bliss. So is that true? Is that not? I'll leave that there. I want to get your insight, Professor, on what is truly education from the Islamic context, and perhaps if you could tie that in with why it's so important. Please, Professor Rizvi.
Thank you. I mean, after that very comprehensive answer, I'm not sure I have anything useful to add. I mean, insofar as education is a training which comprises the moral and the metaphysical, the affective and the ontological, the practical, the everyday, the communal. I think it's already been quite well dealt with. I think one thing which I think the two elements which I would try to stress. One is the idea of the holistic nature of education, or the holistic nature of the way in which the moral and the metaphysical formation of the individual works. And the moral and metaphysical formation of the individual embedded within a society, embedded within a culture, a community. I think that's very significant and important to stress. So, in the past and even nowadays, people get worked up into thinking in terms of the distinction between, say, religious education and secular education, which in itself is not a categorical distinction which you'll find within the tradition. as well as, useful and not useful. We also talk about the cultural division between STEM and HAS subjects in our context. And a holistic approach, I think, is a more useful one. And that is reflected very much in the tradition, where there is a sense in which, we learn things, we acquire ways of being from our formal learning. But at the same time, we also have the aspect of what's known as tarbiyah, right? So the way in which we are nurtured and we are raised. And so, we learn in many different ways of how it is that we should be human. And ultimately, that is the goal. The goal is to realize one's humanity, which is absolutely essential. But alongside that, the second point I really would like to stress is about the inculcation of the love of education, or the love for learning, or the love or the desire to know. I think that's really key. You mentioned one of these famous definitions of hikmah, of wisdom, to begin with, the lost property of the believer. Another one, which of course is also a famous saying of Amir al-Mu'minin alayhi salam, is that hikmah, or wisdom, is knowing where you are, where you're coming from, and where you're going. So this is, of course, about you in your world, where you're coming from, and we know we are always coming from, and we're always going to one, which of course is God. We are always on the path from God, and we are always on the path to God. And where we're going in terms of how we understand our path in this world, through this world and into the afterlife. So that shows you that wisdom is holistic. It is about things that you need, which are useful for you to live in this world. There are also things that you need to understand your origins and your obligations, your metaphysical and moral obligations, which arise from your origins. And also having an understanding of a theological understanding of the world, so that you know where it is that your destination will be, or where it is that your destination, you'd like your destination to be. Alongside that, the question of the love for learning, or the love for education, I think is an important one to stress, because often what happens is when children start out at school, they often are very enthusiastic right at the beginning. And then something happens where they decide they just don't want to go to school anymore. And this always happens. I mean, we remember this when we were kids, and we see this with our kids as they're growing up. There comes a point, and that point comes, I think, out of habituation, where the enthusiasm is lost because maybe they're no longer being challenged in a particular way, or maybe their questions that they're asking are not being responded to, or the skills and the inquisitive minds that they have are not being nurtured. I think they're wider kind of issues. So we want to keep that enthusiasm and that love. And love for your community, love for improving yourself, love of God. We know again from many hadith that love is the basis of faith, right? So the iman is hope. We have so many hadith on this. So we need to understand how that love acts as a great motivating factor. If you have a love for learning, a love for knowledge, a love for wisdom, a love for understanding, then you're going to be reading books, you're going to be engaging with people, you're going to be debating and discussing things. You'll want to practically implement what you know and share that with others. So I think I would very much stress that issue of love, and how we nurture that love and don't allow it to become stale, or sort of a person becoming despondent. Because as I said, all of us are enthusiastic at the beginning, and then we become cynical and we become jaded. And unfortunately, that seems to happen very, very early on, and increasingly early on. And I think we can go into many reasons why that happens, because of all sorts of different stimuli which occur. But the holistic nature and the love for learning are the two key things which I would stress.
Very good, very good. I think those are pivotal, getting into the crux of this conversation, of having a holistic approach that is not just focused on one dimension of understanding, such as, for example, just science or just math. But there may be other elements, and vice versa. If someone's simply in the humanities, maybe they may benefit from some understanding of the sciences, and most importantly, I think, inculcating this love of learning continuously. In fact, there's numerous studies that have shown just having the presence of books in your household can have a positive impact on children. They may ask about them, they may pull them. I think the study that I was reading was talking about 500 books threshold. I don't know if everyone has room for that many books, but with digital books and things of this nature, there may be some way. But just eventually, once somebody may pick up a book and say, well, what is this about? And that inquisitiveness can really arise. And it's very important to keep that going. Very, very well stated, Professor Rizvi. I'm going to come to Haja Nawal on this issue of the goal of education. That is, some people have come forward today and said that, the system of education that we have in our modern world is based on the Industrial Revolution or the post-Industrial Revolution era, with a goal to help people or to create resources for work, essentially jobs. The idea being that people get trained in order to do very systematic procedures, adding, subtracting, things of this nature, so they can work on assembly lines, they can work in management of assembly lines, they can work in industrial environments. And with the nature of how our world is evolving, in fact, that may need to change with the AI revolution happening and the progress that may ensue. Computers may automate many of the things that we do today or have been doing. And we may need more creative people. In fact, this is what education experts have been arguing for some time now, that is what needs to be done. So I just wanted to kind of come to you, Haja Nawal, that what is the goal of education, or maybe perhaps what has been the goal of education, what is currently the goal of education, and also where should it be? So a status quo analysis, and then where actually should we be on this front, or is everything okay? Please, your comments on that.
Thank you. So we all know Islam in itself, and I'm not an Islamic scholar, of course, but I learned throughout the years and from my holy book and so forth. One verse that really struck my mind is when God subhanahu wa ta'ala called in the Quran, يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم. That's the Surah Al-Hujurat, section 13. So we have created you male and female, and made you nations and tribes so that you may know one another. And so this is very powerful verse to start with. And so the aim of education, according to the Islamic philosophy here, is to help and facilitate a child's learning and or one's learning in such a way to acquire Allah's attributes according to one's ability, and then so that one can act accordingly. And after being helped in developing physically, which is tarbiyah, growing, Allah says, I have not created jinn and mankind except to serve me. So it depends on how you look at it. So what's the aim of education? Is it from an Islamic scholarly perspective, or is it from philosophers, European philosophers? Each have a different perspective. So on our end, like as a community, we all know it is to serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through the various traits that God had instilled in us. And by us growing and developing those skills, we're able to serve for a good cause. And that's really the bottom line. It really wraps up everything. Let's look at it from, the philosophy, European philosophy as an example. We have different philosophers that, came to create, such as Socrates and, Emerson, etc. So, and there have been different eras during the lifetime where education has evolved into different nature. So there's a few philosophies. I don't know if I can, get into that. So there's the perennialism, philosophy, which aims, the aim of education is to ensure that students acquire understandings about the great ideas of Western civilizations. That's at the time. And these ideas have the potential for solving problems in any era. And the focus is to teach ideas that are everlasting, to seek enduring truths, which are constant, not changing, as the natural and human worlds at their most essential level do not change. So, these philosophies don't stem out of nowhere. So there has been growth over ages from the different centuries and so forth. So this is a mix of knowledge from different, it includes partially from Islam as well. So essentialism is another philosophy, which is, it believes that there is a common core of knowledge that needs to be transmitted to students in a systematic and disciplined way. And the emphasis here is, is on the intellectual and moral standards that schools should teach, as an example. And the core of the curriculum is essential knowledge and skills and academic rigor that essentialists accept the idea with that. And then schooling should be practical, etc. So it goes on and on and on. A different philosophy is the progressive system. As an example, the belief in education in this philosophy, it says it should focus on the whole child, okay, rather than on the content of the teacher. So this educational philosophy stresses that students should test ideas by active experimentation. Learning is rooted in the questions of learners that arise through experiencing the world. It is active, not passive. And the learner is a problem solver and thinker who makes meaning through his or her individual experience in the physical and cultural context. And effective teachers provide experiences so students can learn by doing. Another philosophy is the reconstructionism. This is a critical theory which focuses, or it emphasizes the addressing of social questions and a quest to create a better society and a worldwide democracy. There's heavy focus on curriculum that highlights social reform as the aim of education. So social reform here. And then there are philosophers in this era where they, they reacted against the realities of World War II and recognized the potential for either human annihilation through technology and human cruelty, or the capacity to create a beneficent society using technology and human compassion. This is where Dr. Rizvi was touching base. Is it useful knowledge or is it, bad knowledge? So we have to choose here, what is. So what is the aim of education? It really stems from the philosophy of either the nation, the State Department of Education, or whatever it stems at. From an Islamic perspective, it is to serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. From a different political, socio-political perspective, it could be, again, what Dr. Rizvi said, you have to know where you're heading. And I've gone through the Stephen Covey philosophies, is keeping the end in mind, okay? So education could be one way or the other way, and the aim of it depends on, again, the ultimate goals, where we're heading. I hope, I was able to kind of give some brief idea on, even though I was not brief, my apologies.
Thank you for that analysis and sharing that with us. We really appreciate that, and I think that's the lens by which you view the goal of education has an impact. So if there is a holistic approach, or there's a perennial approach, or otherwise, that's going to impact how the end product, so to speak, comes out on the other end. I'm drawn to and reminded of the works of Ken Robinson, who's written several books in this space, and he's given TED Talks. He's argued that schools stifle creativity. Coming to Dr. Rizvi on this one, this idea that he gives the example of, there's a particular goal, the Industrial Revolution, things of that nature, and that has led to a decline in the uniqueness of each individual child's attention being, focused upon. And at the same time, this idea of, just each student just kind of being pushed out on the conveyor belt, so to speak, to just get a cookie cutter education. And he gives the example of a couple of schools, for example, one in the UK, where the school is run very differently, where they actually have a city council or a school council from the very beginning, and they run it like how a town or a city is actually run. And the goal there is they become good citizens, to foster citizenship in the truest sense. Or he gives another example of a school in India where they literally put a computer in front of a group of village children. And these children didn't speak English, nor did they have any inclination towards what a computer was. But interestingly enough, within a week, they were able to figure almost everything out about the device. And so this experiential learning type of approach. So Dr. Rizvi, if you could shed light on what is the Islamic concept of education, starting perhaps with the era of the Prophet and building into Imam Ali's time, as well as the different Imams. If you could kind of broadly at a high level highlight some of the dimensions of how did education evolve in the Islamic context? What would schools or madaris or things like this look like if we were to go through the 1400-year history of Islam?
So that's obviously a very long answer. But before that, let me just mention one thing which ties with your examples. I mean, you know, something which is often said, and I remember experiencing this when my own children were starting school. There were lots of conversations about, you know, did we see what sort of fit did we see the school? You know, did our children kind of understand how they belong? Did they understand that they were part of a community? Did they understand that they had, in a sense, ownership of what the school was and where it was going? So I think the idea of a school being a community is a very important one. It's not kind of a dictatorship where you have someone running things and teachers kind of laying down the law. I mean, obviously, discipline is a different matter, of course, but that the students have a stake in what happens, in how the school works, and how they learn collectively, and how they constitute a community. I think that's very important. Alongside that, I mean, I should say, just to comment on, you know, the reflection of what it is. Sometimes one thinks that schools, and I would include kind of weekend madrasas in centers. There's an element of crowd control, right? It basically keeps the kids off the streets and out of trouble, right? It's like the minimum you want from a school, and that's unfortunately not a terribly lofty ideal for a school. Simple crowd control. This is why, for example, in COVID, all governments are desperate to get schools back open, you know, and running, because they need not only to keep the kids out of trouble, but they also want to make sure that the parents are useful, productive consumers. And they can't do that if they're not going to work, and they have to stay at home and look after the kids. So there's that negative element of it. Now, I think that kind of holistic sense of what the community is, and the sense of becoming a human, becoming a person who's embedded within a community, is something which was very clear from the early period. Of course, in the early period of Islam, you've got a relatively small community that develops. You have, in formal terms, you have small circles of study, of course, starting with the Prophet, then Amir al-Mu'mineen, the other Imams. In the other Muslim denominations, you have other teachers. You know, you had many different teachers in the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina. We know that, and that continued for a while. So you had this kind of informal circles where perhaps the sharp division between the home and the family and this wider community and the educational setting, those divisions were not so sharp. It was like a continuity. The idea was life was a constant process of becoming, of developing, of learning. It was kind of seamless in that way. And of course, that early phase then led to the establishment of institutions, as we know. So just as you had the establishment of political and social institutions, you had the establishment of more formal curricula within the mosque setting, eventually emerging as madrasas in the 10th, well, really the 11th century, and then formalizing through establishing certain areas of study, curricula, stipends for professors to teach certain things, resources for people to learn. So, you know, rooms where they could live and be resident, rooms where they could study, food being paid for, you know, people establishing endowments, awqaf. I mean, the waqf in pre-modern Muslim societies is an extremely important way of supporting all sorts of institutions, If anything, I mean, we seem to have lost sight of the waqf. We certainly remember what and understand what a charity is in the modern period, but you know, it would be nice if we merged the notion of a charity with a waqf, because the whole idea of a waqf was to establish something, and it would be in perpetuity, and it would have guardians who would protect the function and the usage of that waqf, and would make sure that there would be sufficient income from the capital of the waqf to make sure it continued, right? So it was a very, and obviously a waqf was ultimately something that you gave in the way of God, right? So it wasn't selfless, it wasn't your property, it wasn't your family's property, it was something you were doing for God, and you were doing it for the wider community. So it'd be nice to kind of recover the sense of a waqf, and especially awqaf, which are related to education, because another kind of pet peeve of mine is the fact that if you go around lots of Muslim contexts, sometimes it's very easy to raise money for certain types of humanitarian goals, even sometimes for some types of schools. But usually if you raise a number of educational projects, a number of people like, well, no, that doesn't kind of meet our immediate needs. You know, the immediate needs might be much more existential, when we don't always understand that the needs of a person, the educational needs of a person, could be as important as the kind of existential sort of food and water, drinking and shelter ones could be. So, you know, the establishment of institutions and how you then sustain those institutions of learning was something we can see from the pre-modern Islamic period and beyond. Now, one element which I should mention is that even that culture was not devoid of instrumentalism, right? So the institutions were also designed to produce people who would be officials in administration, who would act as judges in particular jurisdictions, you know, who would act as notaries and so forth. But there were also plenty of people who went to those institutions who didn't do any of those sorts of things. You know, there were people who literally went for the love of learning, and that was an acceptable thing. It was acceptable to kind of travel around with your books and kind of, you know, lose your books or have books fall on you and get crushed under the weight of your books. You know, the idea of like moving from one place to another in search of a particular text or someone who could explain a particular field of inquiry to you. I think that kind of desire, which was nurtured by those institutions and by the awqaf system and patronage, is something which would be really useful to kind of revive. I mean, certainly, I think if you're going to be running schools, especially Islamic schools in the present, they really should be run on a waqf foundation. It doesn't make sense to not to run it like that. And that requires actually thinking about education in a non-commercial sense. Unfortunately, what's happened is we're now looking in education, whether it's schools or universities, purely as a business. I know this, I work in a university which officially is a state university, but in effect it's a business, right? It's run like a business. And that when it becomes like that, and when the students consider themselves to be recipients of services or being consumers, then their whole attitude towards the classroom is very different. You know, this is not the attitude that Amir al-Mu'mineen said, you know, then I become their slave for the rest of life. It's more like, teach me something because I paid for it, damn it, you know. Or especially nowadays with online learning, people wanting rebates and refunds on their fees because, you know, it's not the same kind of service that they're receiving. You know, once we start looking at education as a service that you pay for, everything is lost. Whereas it's, you know, it should really about looking at it as a framework for you to become properly human, to become a useful, you know, mu'addab, you know, person of adab, a useful person in society, in the community.
Very well said. I imagine you're tenured and hence have the ability to speak in such frankness, which is I think good.
Oh, I've had tenure for many years, and I'm very blunt about how things work.
Which is quite interesting because a lot of people, I'm very interested. I'd like to draw our audience's attention to the idea of why tenure was developed in education. And it was due to these conflicting interests, because many times professors were required to do research or highly encouraged to do research, but there's a problem that arises. What if that research conflicts with the interest of the institution? And so how do you balance these two elements of the equation? And hence the tenure system emerged to give freedom and autonomy, and not and professors not having to worry about this notion of losing their job over speaking the truth, because that's really, education should be about getting to this truth of the matter. You highlighted so many things. I know the Islamic heritage of WAQFs and all of these elements of institutions. There have been arguments made that modern institutions in some capacity lend a lot of, or at least some component of their success, to the Islamic madrasa systems or other circles. For example, the idea of chairs, chair of mathematics, chair of physics, chairs of astronomy at the university level. Well, that comes directly from kursi, or this idea that you'd have this dynamic where you'd have the student sitting on the ground, and then you'd have the teacher who's sitting on a chair. It's interesting that now the dynamics seem to be turned in our world, where the professors oftentimes standing and the students are seated. But nonetheless, the idea of the symbolic chair comes from that. So Dr. Rizvi, I'm actually going to go to you on this one, because it's connected directly to something that you alluded to. And there's been this era of Islam that even Orientalists or Westerners or non-Muslims have argued, 800 to 1100 AD, at least that's what they say. It may be much more than that. That this was the golden era of Islam, the golden age of Islam, where we got mathematics and different types of astronomy, sciences that emerged. And many Muslims even look back and say, that what an era, what a time, and we gave this to the world and we gave that to the world. Yet the question remains, a society that's looking in the rearview mirror is not looking forward. And hence the question is, well, what happened then and what are we missing now? What led to that thriving, so to speak, and what led to the quote unquote downfall, if you will, today? And how can that be revived, if that can be revived?
So of course, again, that's a complicated question. I mean, another thing, of course, which the European universities did was they took on the Awqaf system. So, places like Oxford and Paris were built on endowments. They were built on basically what we'd call religious endowments. People, endowing college, as a godly pursuit, for their soul, basically, and of course, places like Oxford and Cambridge still thrive on those endowments, which are 12th, 13th, 14th century. Now, of course, this question of what went wrong is a complicated one. Things did not kind of fall apart that quickly. Certainly within the madrasa system, within scholarly circles, within the observatories and so forth, there was a very important conception which a number of my colleagues and I've written about recently, which is this idea that of tahqiq, right? Of inquiry, of realizing arguments, which was very vibrant all the way up to the colonial period. And this is this notion that you didn't just receive ideas and arguments and merely rehearse them. So you didn't just, I guess what you might call practice taqleed with respect to them, but rather you only really knew them if you could do your own tahqiq, if you could do your own inquiries which related to that particular topic, right? If you could do your own calculations, if you could come up with your own examples, if you could come up with better arguments, right? So this period of tahqiq actually, in fact, people talk about the period of 15 to 1700 and arguably even 1800 as the kind of the pinnacle of this culture of tahqiq, which existed within the scholarly traditions of the three kind of big empires, the Ottomans, the Safavids and the Mughals in particular. So that was there. Of course, what really kind of shifts and where this decline narrative really kicks in, of course, is with colonialism, right? So when you have the colonial encroachment, and there's of course many reasons why it happens, but the major rupture is an epistemological rupture. The major rupture is a conception of what knowledge is, what science is, what is the function of education. A shift away from some of these traditional institutions, a replacement with successful institutions. And the successful institutions are the ones which are of the victor, the colonial victor. So that starts being coming into place, particularly in the 19th century, the late 18th, 19th century, in British colonial contexts, in the French colonial contexts were even more, I guess you would call, savagely interventionist. And I use the word savagely very specifically and deliberately, because they fundamentally wiped out a way of life. They destroyed a way of life. They destroyed an archive. They destroyed a memory. They destroyed ways of learning and doing, which were very important. And then they replaced it with a different system, which was an imported colonial system. And for a while, it took a while for people to realize that they had not just been politically dominated in culture and colonized, but actually they'd been intellectually and epistemologically colonized as well. So that then within Muslim societies, you had schools and universities which were established, which did not reflect their own values, did not reflect their understanding of what knowledge was, what the pursuit of knowledge was, but rather reflected a certain model of power relationships with respect to knowledge, which came from the colonizer, right? And so then you get the beginning of the pursuit of knowledge, of schools, of universities being geared towards what was in the interests of the colonial power, right? So you want people to study in English or in French. You want them to study certain exact sciences and engineering and so forth, and medicine, so that they can serve the colonial state, so that they can actually perpetuate that state and be the effective cogs of that empire. And that model then has been one which, even in the post-colonial context, people have been unable to shake off. It is those models which were established in the 19th and 20th century. You can look across the Muslim world and you see this, right? Now, of course, now what's happening is that people are realizing that, but it's not just Muslims who are realizing that. Across the world, we're having this kind of whole wave of decolonization of knowledge going on, in which we're realizing that actually some of the categories, some of the notions of enlightenment, for example, which were established in the 18th century, were really essential ideas for the betterment of the colony, for the betterment of the empire, right? The idea of progress, of material progress in particular. All these ideas which became embedded in the way in which people thought and the way in which we thought were trained, is fundamentally not fit for purpose. Because then people started realizing, okay, so I am this particular person in this particular place. I'm going to the school, which doesn't actually reflect where I come from at all. Not at all. It's completely dissonant with my home, or it's completely dissonant with my immediate community, or it's reflecting the schizophrenia of my immediate community. Dariush Shairan wrote a wonderful book a number of years ago about cultural schizophrenia, which is something which has affected a number of Muslim societies in the way in which they were finally coming to grips with what had happened in colonial modernity. But at the same time, they'd become so invested in colonial modernity, they were kind of torn. Do they continue with colonial modernity, or do they try to recover some sense of what it meant to be authentically Iranian or Indian or Syrian or whatever, right? So that's something which has happened, and I guess now we can have a bit of distance for that, because we've seen all sorts of failed models across the Muslim world. I'm talking about the majority thing. We can come and of course talk about the European and the American context in a second as well. And so the possibilities of rethinking things, I think, are much more open to us now. We've seen the failure of certain types of modernism. We've seen the failures of nationalisms. We've seen the failures of communisms. We've seen the failures of Islamisms, right? all of the isms, they've all failed, right? And they've all failed not just in simple power terms, but they also mostly failed in terms of actually bringing together societies which we think are mutually flourishing and mutually beneficial, right? Forget the question of GDP and stuff on the side, or forget this kind of very artificial notion of happiness, which some Gulf states, for example, might promote. But think in terms of, societies where you feel comfortable, where you recognize yourself, where you engage with the other person in a mutually beneficial manner, where the function of sitting with people of knowledge, the famous thing of many sayings, including Amir al-Mu'mineen or the other Imam saying, sit with people of knowledge because they are truly alive. Sit with them because sitting with them reminds you of God. Sit with them because it will make you happy, right? We seem to have completely forgotten this. I mean, there's a whole other question about where are these true people of knowledge nowadays. That's a different matter altogether. But certainly this sense of what we're trying to do has been lost, and the kind of the destruction of colonial modernity is something which perhaps to a certain extent we still need to understand how that's worked. And it continues to work because that the logic of that colonial modernity works within Britain. It works in the United States in so many different ways, in the way in which the state deals with different communities, the way the state deals with particular neighborhoods and cities and so forth. That is still there. And we need to understand, what the problem is before we can start to address it.
Very, very well stated, and on so many levels. Thank you for giving that overview of the dynamics. And I think the idea of happiness, and I think you kind of alluded to that towards the end, is very important because in my background in economics, as well as my research interests in leadership and innovation, there's a very strong correlation between quote unquote progress, as you alluded to, and unhappiness, gross unhappiness. I mean, you look at the dynamics of modern developed countries, wherever they may be, on the East or the West. There's a higher rate of mental health related issues, higher rates of suicide across the board. And so although one aspect of the equation may have been addressed well, it may not be, as we started our conversation, holistic. There may be it may leave much to be desired. Haja Nawal, if I may come to you, I actually really want to make this very real for our audience. I know we've discussed many theoretical and also practical dimensions, but really in the crux of it. I know in some parts of the world, especially our audience, there are certain mandatory educational elements that are coming forward that schools are implementing, and many people may not be in favor of that, or they may have a different view of how it should be taught to their particular children who are going to schools. And this has led to a broader conversations about, should we go with this established schools or should we create our own schools? And it's actually led to many people scrambling to try to establish their own schools very quickly, or Islamic schools, I should say, because of this concern. And so I really wanted to get to the heart of this conversation and say, well, if the system that exists is not comprehensive or is not holistic, based on many of the things that we've identified, such as lack of creativity or lack of religious or spiritual or humanities and things of this nature, well, what does a holistic education look like? And is that something that we can go through the traditional channels of schooling, or should we establish our own institutions? Or perhaps at a third level, do we influence the established systems to actually tend or bend more towards being more inclusive? Your thoughts on that, Haja Nawal, please.
This is a very, very important discussion, actually. I'm at the philosophy where there's no size that fits all. So there's no one system that is the perfect ideal system for everybody. Just like if you go to a place to buy a shirt, what may fit you, it doesn't fit someone else, and so forth. Education is in a way similar. So, and it all stems from the fact that we are all different in our philosophies, in our expectations, in our goals, in what we, want our children to know. what kind of environment we want them in, and what kind of knowledge we want them to know. And so I think having a diverse system, or diverse systems, multiple systems, gives the parents a choice, an option where to send their kids to. Having traditional school system is not sufficient to meet the expectations of all parents. That does not necessarily mean they're not doing a good job. It's on the contrary, they may be doing a great job to some communities and a lousy job to others. Having private schools may not be the perfect system either, but it will serve the needs of many families. Now, there are private systems that are religious in nature, and some other systems that do not teach religion. So, and again, it depends on, you know, where the families would like their kids to go to. Now, the philosophy of having challenging the traditional systems came up in the early 90s, where charter school systems came to existence. And the charter school systems are public schools. And public schools come in two forms. So now it's a traditional system and a charter school. Both are public. And public means they're funded by the state. And so they're free to the parents. And they provide free education and even food services, support, whatever it is. And then you have, you know, other than Islamic schools, you have other faith schools. And again, you know, so by the disadvantages of a traditional school, it does operate on the basis of one size fits all. So if you're living in a certain community or city, you're stuck there if whether you can afford it or not afford it. If you can afford it, you get to send your kids outside that district or within the district to a private school or whatever it may be. But if you are not able to afford, so you're stuck there. You know, the charter school got you unstuck. So you're no longer obligated to send your kids to a traditional school. You can send them to a choice school. And these charter schools operate on a philosophy, they can differ. They're not all the same. So in our case, as an example, we have 4 public school academies that were founded about 23 years ago. And we're on the, you know, we are based on a philosophy that kind of caters to the community, a certain community, which means it's a, you know, the majority of our students come from an Islamic background. We don't teach religion. So that's a disadvantage. We don't teach religion, but then religion, that's, you know, because we are so diverse in nature, not everybody practices the same faith in the same way. So, and then parents choose where to send them to after school or weekends and so forth. So by diversifying the educational systems provides opportunities for families of all backgrounds to send their kids wherever they want to send them. So, and it's not everybody is raised the same way either. So even students, they learn from many different ways. So some of us are visual, some of us are artistic, some are, you know, we learn through music as an example. Some we learn just simply by memory. So because we're made differently, again, the school systems, regardless of what kind of system they are, they have to diversify, use multiple strategies and differentiated instruction to reach the minds and souls of those students. And I do agree that this traditional mentality that this is how we teach kids by memory, that does not work at all. It hasn't worked in the past, and it will not work in the future and nowadays. So the most ideal and holistic approach to teaching students is to zero in on the needs of the students and also where the students are at, what really makes them learn, what motivates them, what they like, what they don't like, including cultural aspects in there to motivate them, to help them feel comfortable within the system they're in. So it doesn't matter what institution they're in. So it's the again, the strategies that the teacher uses in the classroom and the resources that are available, that can be made available to the teachers. And beyond that, training the teachers to build the skill level to help them reach out to those students to maximize their potential so they can enjoy learning, to make learning fun, to you know, bring the best out of the students, out of their mind, make them love learning, They become creative as the teacher can be. So, and then we model as adults. When we model, we don't just say, hey, read A, B, C, D, and etc. No, in order for us to instill that knowledge and the creativity, we demonstrate. So we are role models as adults, and children are very observant. And they may not say much, but they observe and they absorb just like sponges, and they pick up all of this from the surroundings, and eventually it shapes who they are. And it is very sensitive what we teach our kids. So the parents who are maybe confused as to which school to send them to, it's very important that they pay a visit and they are engaged throughout the entire process, not just, we enroll them here, the school is totally responsible. No, the first school is really the parents and the home, and the second school is the actual school. And the teacher is not everything. So a lot of the students by nature, they fall in love with their teacher, especially at the elementary level. We have to really be careful with that. And sometimes we trust teachers. We should trust them. We should value them and appreciate them. But at the same token, people come with all kinds of baggages. They may have motives. So it's important that parents know the teachers and know what's going on in the classroom. And not only that, get to know your child and also train the child to become very open about discussing anything, so they can tell you what's going on, so you're engaged, you understand that the teacher is really teaching the right things. Not only the teacher, even the school as a philosophy. Is my child in the right school? Is the child going to be influenced by that kind of structure? We have something in the Middle Eastern communities, as an example. They're very highly impressed by foreign schools that are French, American, etc., etc. What they don't understand, that each school has a mission and has a vision. It may be the same, it may be completely different. And having quality education is not sufficient. Quality education has to align with our expectations. If the quality is excellent, yet it's moving our children in a different direction than we want them to, we're in trouble. So having a balanced education involves multiple factors. Again, it stems from our philosophy as parents, as a community, where we want our kids to be at 10 years from now, 5 years from now, 20 years from now, and then creating that environment that supports that kind of education, that supports, the philosophy that we want them to get to. And so education is not necessarily only the school. It's also the Islamic centers that we attend. We have to be mindful with our conversations at home. Like, okay, sometimes we tend to criticize some center over another, as an example. That impacts the mentality of our kids as we raise them. And, it's not a holistic education here. We're all responsible to provide that holistic education to our children. Be it at home, in the school, in the center, even the youth organizations, they may be lacking. We may be lacking activities that support that philosophy that we have as parents. We gotta, find these institutions and support them and help them, help us, help our children, help our community children. And we are all responsible. كلكم راع وكلكم مسؤول عن رعيته. So we are all responsible for what happens to our kids, what happens to our community kids. At the end, also who our kids interact with. And so that gives them, it's a part of the holistic education. When they go to a very well-rounded school and they receive well-rounded education, yet they are interacting with the wrong kids. That's going to really bring in a little virus into the educational system of their children, and it's going to possibly, get them to drift into something that they would not expect. And subhanAllah, we always say, Allahumma thabbit qalbi ala dini, meaning, I ask God to, help me, give me the strength to maintain that faith, which means we are subject to drifting. So as our kids. So we need to be mindful of all the environments that surround us. We don't necessarily dictate, but we have this open communication with our children, open communication with the community, to help us exchange ideas and lead and guide and, you know, support the environment that gets them to be where they need to be at. And it doesn't come free. We may have to donate to those institutions. We may have to do whatever it takes. When we see a structure and a system that is working in the direction that we believe in, we are responsible in helping them develop and grow and supporting them even financially and whatever it takes, even volunteering as well. So we are all part of, you know, the community. We have to contribute in one way or another, whether it's time, money, whatever it is. And this mainstay in particular, to me, plays such a key. I didn't want to get into this at all initially, but I think it is worth mentioning. The role of mainstay is very heavy. It's very important in the lives and education of the students, the youth. And that's what really interests me in the mainstay in itself. And, you know, all those centers as well, we have to continue to support them. And there's no system that's perfect. By the fact that they may not be perfect, it doesn't mean we don't support them. And even ourselves as individuals, we are not perfect. So rather than critiquing, maybe contributing to their growth, contributing to helping them become better and better, we are all responsible for one another.
Very, very well said, Haja Nawal. Thank you, highlighting the idea that one size does not necessarily fit all their different goals. I know that coming to Professor Rizvi, I know that in this side of the pond, that is the U.S., many parents, even from Muslim backgrounds, will send their children to even Catholic institutions or otherwise because they may be the best institutions in town. That may be true in other parts of the world as well. But now coming back to this issue of mandatory education that is happening in certain parts of the world where many parents don't feel comfortable, there's this scramble to try to see, should we establish our own, should we ban or stop these things? And this may become a bigger issue as time progresses. Having said that, Dr. Rizvi, with the K through 12 and even going into the collegiate level and university level and beyond, should we be setting up our own institutions? Or again, it's not one size fits all? Maybe what's true at the K through 12 may not be true at the collegiate level. Should we, perhaps maybe everyone should be getting involved in the PTAs or the parent-teacher associations or different things to have a voice, to voice concern and be a part of the table and have these types of discussions. But looking at the future of our community, Dr. Rizvi, what, in your opinion, should we be doing in terms of education? Setting up our own, or again, or trying to influence the system that exists, or something else?
So I think it depends a lot on different contexts and what you want. One thing I would say is that establishing, say, an Islamic school and sending your kids to an Islamic school as kind of a defense mechanism I'm not convinced that's a good idea. Because ultimately you can't shield people. You can't shield your kids. You can't isolate yourself from your wider society. There are lots of stimuli which come in. It's practically impossible to do that. Certainly not in this day and age. That would not really work. If you want to establish an Islamic school because you think that's the context in which the kids will be the best kind of rounded individuals who are embedded within a community, then of course that's an entirely different issue. But I sometimes suspect that a lot of people have this kind of defensive knee-jerk reaction to the desire to set up their own institutions. And that defensiveness is not terribly useful, right? And in most contexts, what I would say is that it makes much more sense to engage with institutions which exist. Make those institutions ones in which you can find yourself and you can find your children as belonging, as being part of that. Make it your own. As you said, be involved in PTAs. Be active in encouraging the staff hires in terms of teachers, etc., so that the teachers are much more reflective of the wider community. And also at universities, endow positions, establish centers of learning within existing educational institutions, because certainly at the university level, it's not like schools. You can't just suddenly start from scratch because you're not really going to go anywhere. Universities are very hierarchical. Everyone knows who the best, universities are, and then there's kind of different tiers. So if you suddenly establish something, it's going to go at the bottom of the pile. It takes a very long time for a university to become established as an elite university, and it also requires a lot of money. Cases like Stanford are very rare. Okay, that required a lot of money. So that doesn't happen overnight. So it certainly at university level, it would make much more sense for people to think in terms of contributing to existing institutions and helping change those institutions so they're much more reflective of wider communities which they serve. And I think to a certain extent, some universities are open to that. Increasingly, they are. Increasingly, universities are aware of their catchment and the local communities that they serve, other types of communities. So that kind of engagement is extremely important to get involved in. And also, I mean, the idea of the seamless kind of continuous education that, as it's already been said, Haja, Nawal, and you mentioned as well, you start with your immediate environment at home. You start with other stimuli. You really want people to understand that they're constantly in this process of learning. Every encounter they have is something which gives them an opportunity to learn and to become. Everything from the strangest kind of TikTok video that you come across, to anything that you see on Snapchat and social media. I mean, obviously, don't kind of spam on WhatsApp, especially don't spam on issues of COVID. But everything you engage with actually is an opportunity to learn and to understand, and sometimes to understand from what is obviously nonsensical, right? So a lot of the stimuli we get in this world are nonsense. I mean, they're not alternative facts, they're just nonsense. And so, that actually helps you understand what a fact is. That helps you understand the utility of truthfulness if you're constantly bombarded with falsehoods and lies. So, you don't just turn away from that. I don't really have anything useful to say beyond that. But I think, as I said, if there are good positive reasons for doing so, yes, do so. But I suspect in many cases, people do sometimes have quite negative reasons, or at least defensive reasons why they want to do certain things. And that's understandable. I mean, I'm not saying that necessarily is a bad thing in itself, but, defensiveness only gets you to a certain point.
Sure. And our questions have started to trickle in. Haji Nawal, I want to just bring this to you, but I'm going to comment myself. What sort of mentorship programs are needed, and how can they be implemented? I wanted to slightly, and I'll come to you in a moment on that, I wanted to slightly share a different perspective on this idea or this concept of institutions. My personal opinion, and of course we may have, and we welcome differences of opinion here, is actually having top tier Islamic institutions, similar to how you have Catholic institutions where Muslim families send their children because they're the best schools, or for example, French or otherwise, because they're the best schools. We should perhaps consider in the long run investing in, and I'm speaking at least at the K through 12 and perhaps eventually down the road, I definitely agree resources are definitely needed. But if I can give one example, I mean, I was born and raised in the United States, but when I was in my youth, our family moved to a particular Middle Eastern country, and it was an Islamic environment. It was a developed Islamic country. And I remember very distinctively when we came back after about 4, almost 5 years, there was a very particular instance where I was in my American school once again, and there was an incident, social things happen, peer pressures, parts of the dynamics, and there had been a particular song that had come out. It was a popular culture song, so it's not even something that you could make an argument that under Islamic law would be permitted, for example, as classical or something like that. And everyone was asking, have you heard it? And I remember them asking me, and I distinctly said that, I don't listen to music, obviously keeping popular music in mind. And it was as if the whole cafeteria had turned, and it's as if they had seen an alien, because they had never seen someone who didn't listen to music. And it seems so aloof and so different and so, and we as human beings have a nature to want to fit in. I've heard this idea that, homeschooling, people throw around this popular narrative that children who are homeschooled are kind of socially awkward. I mean, in my lecturing from throughout coast to America, even Canada and Europe, every family that I've seen, their kids who are homeschooled are actually very polished and very refined in a lot of ways. And that's one option as well. If someone wants to, I know that's resource intensive to obviously homeschool. That's not the easiest thing. But that's one option as well. But Islamic, I think, high caliber Islamic institutions, we perhaps may not want to write them off because there is, as Haja Nawal also alluded to, there's a drift that exists in society. If you look at, and this is a sociological dimension, if you go to California in the United States, the culture there is very different than, for example, the Bible Belt or Mississippi in the South. It's going to be two different worlds, although it's at the same country. And so that has an impact. Silicon Valley has a certain drift that is towards entrepreneurship. The Caribbean, so one may argue, has a certain drift that is towards taking it easy. This is what some have argued. Similarly, the Northeast of America, very fast tempo, the New York minute, as they say, this idea, those things have an impact on the surrounding. So I wonder, I do agree to this point that, to fully sort of shelter someone's not the easiest thing. And that nor should we even try to be doing that. We should teach principles. But at the same time, I remember, being in this Middle Eastern Islamic country, hearing the azan from the loudspeakers had an impact on me, feeling that I was no longer living in an environment where I was an alien or a foreigner, so to speak. And that has an impact perhaps psychologically on a child growing up. And it's important for us to realize that we all belong. Everyone has a space. And in the Islamic dimension of the equation, a Christian or Jew or otherwise is welcome. I draw our attention to this idea of what Imam Ali very famously said to Malik al-Ashtar in his letter, that, you're equal in faith or equal in humanity. And so that may be another option. But I think the point hits home, one size does not fit all. If you are concerned as a parent about certain mandatory educational systems, it may make sense to get involved, have a conversation with the school, have a conversation about the future of the community, and do something in that regard. Haja Nawal, if I may come back to you on this question, what sort of mentorship programs are needed and how can they be implemented in our community? This idea that, education is one side of the equation, but you also need mentorship to actually prepare someone, to groom someone, to actually get into the real world. Any thoughts on that?
Good question. So you all heard of the Big Brother, Big Sister mentoring program. So these are actually kind of originated by different groups, from a cultural perspective, may and may not work for our community, but this is a good start. Having our own big brother, big sister would be a great idea. So we can, parents can, working between the school and the system that may yet to exist. I am not aware of any system like that within our community that exists. We are all professionals. We all have multiple skills, and we're all good in some way or another. Matching those students to those individuals, all of us, whoever is successful, can really have the greatest impact on our youth. So it's my dream project, or my dream goal is to see a system like this exist, because students get influenced from early childhood, from early on, by adults, whether it's their parents to start with or as they're growing up. And they should be free to really associate with someone like that, provided there's a trust factor with that individual, or these individuals are associated within an institution with nothing, no goals in mind other than to give back of themselves, to serve, to help the youth as they continue to grow. Especially the troubled youth that may be involved in drugs and other, stuff. We shouldn't really wait till they're older. We should start early on before it gets to that. Because I've seen how some adults, other than, from our community and outside the community, it doesn't matter. They try out of interest in making money, as an example. They approach as a big brother, big sister from a wrong perspective. So I think our Islamic institutions need to work hard on that to make sure that we have the right people who can be serving in that capacity. That would be a good mentoring program. So mentoring program comes in multiple ways. So one could be religious based, one could be business based, one could be any other career based, as an example. So the main focus here is to really build that personality and ethics, and it really stems from home to begin with anyway. But as kids experience challenges in life, they want to talk to somebody, they want to be, and even if they're drifting, if they have someone they trust that they can talk to, that can lead them in the right direction, that have that skill, they are trained in mentoring, they are trained, and they are knowledgeable in their faith and so forth. I think this will really help resolve many of the issues that we're experiencing nowadays with the youth. Had the parents started early on with that, it would have really addressed these issues. And then the parents' engagement, very, very important parents' engagement in the school system to begin with, regardless of what school system it is. And I do agree with Dr. Rizvi that, you don't have to really build a new system, just work within the system that you have and the systems that we have. So there are options already existing. We have Islamic schools, we have charter schools, we have traditional schools, we have all kinds of schools. So work with them. And if they're really, these systems, if they really aim to be successful, they're going to be open-minded and they're going to tailor to the needs of the students. So if the need of the student is to grow culturally, they're going to include that at some point or another. I recall at one point I had to move my son from an Islamic school to a traditional school. And he was an A+ student, a very well accomplished student. And he got a D when I moved him in the first semester. So I had to pay a visit to the school and find out exactly what happened. And it turned out she didn't have any culture embedded in the curriculum. So she started talking about Eid and halal and celebration. And out of nowhere, my son changed completely and became shifted right away. He became normal and he started to accomplish what he used to accomplish, got A's, and he's a physician now. So he's very successful. But the cultural values are very important in the life of the student and the education of the student. So when the students are going to school, the teacher needs to relate to the experiences of the students and connect with the student. So that is sort of a mentoring as well. So mentoring is not necessarily just a group as well. It is within the school system and connecting, aligning and connecting students and assigning them to others. There are older students like high school students who would be good fit to mentor the younger kids. That's another way within the system that we do, especially if you have a newcomer where, this is a new kid on the block, they could be bullied, they could be, exposed to any different bad experiences, but by assigning them this mentoring, the right mentoring, it will help the students fit in and adjust to a new system and, kind of growing within.
Thank you so much. I know we're really edging on time. I just want to get a couple of more questions in rapid fire, if I may, 60 seconds or less. Dr. Rizvi, if I can ask you this, because I had alluded to some of these in the beginning and I don't want to leave them left out. A curriculum, an Islamic curriculum, if we go through the time of the Holy Prophet, the Imams and things of this nature, based on that historical perspective, if we use that, what subjects would you include in a modern Islamic holistic education curriculum?
I guess it depends a lot on which level you're talking about. I think one thing which I would definitely do, it's kind of a pet sort of favorite of mine, is the study of philosophy. I think philosophy should be studied from early ages. We know that kids always ask very profound questions, and so that should be kind of nurtured. Certainly philosophy is extremely important at a university level, or the humanities as such is very important at the university level. The study of literature as well, not just for linguistic purposes, but also because literature was traditionally studied because it was a humanity, because it was something which helped you understand what it meant to be human. So that is important as well. And the other thing I would say, and this is something which Islamic schools in particular tend to avoid is the arts. So by the arts, I mean the plastic arts, as well as things like music and drama, because the arts are very much the way in which it's one of the key kind of languages of societies, not just the language of Muslim societies, but also of many of the societies in which we live. The arts are kind of privileged in a particular way. Now, it's not just about kind of high art or difficult art, as some sometimes said, but actually, the everyday elements of culture which are lived by us. And sometimes we can recognize art and music in things which we might not necessarily describe as art or music. And previously when we were having a conversation, we were talking about lots of things which are associated with the commemoration of Ashura and Muharram in many societies involves artistic performance, display, certainly musical performance and display as part of that culture. And we don't necessarily call it that, but that's one way we can realize that the arts are very much part of what we are. And the aesthetics of our experience as cultural beings, as religious beings, is something which then the study of the arts would attune us to that aesthetic sense, which I think is very important.
Very good. Thank you so much, Dr. Rizvi. Haja Nawal, just if I can ask you this, there's a lot of tendency in our communities, particularly Asian background communities, to focus on STEM in particular and go into those fields. Is this perhaps what we should be doing? Doctor, engineer, maybe lawyer, and then nothing else? Or any ideas on what we should be encouraging our next generation to pursue in terms of their life, careers?
In our program, when we prepare our high school students to move on to college, we do what we call an interest survey. So we identify what the students love the most and what they're best at, and so to help them move in a direction to find their passion. And if I can stress anything, it's to do that, So every individual, every one of us is born and made to be good in one thing. If we can help our students discover what they're really good at, what their passion is, that's the direction to send them in. STEM is only one tool that prepares the students to instill the basic skills in science, technology, English, and math. So if they have those basics, they would be they'll be positioned in a stronger position to be successful as they pursue their career goals by going to college and so forth. But that not necessarily pushing them to become doctors or engineers against their passion or against their will. They could be artistic as well, and we're asking them to become doctors and they're not inclined in science to be successful. We're really pushing them in the wrong way. So I think we need to push our kids to be successful in what their passion is, finding the passion and help them grow within that area so they can maximize their potential and be successful and happy in their life while they're still, supporting their faith and, maintaining their faith. Thank you.
Very well stated. Thank you. Thank you so much. I was just drawn to what Dr. Rizvi had said and tied in so nicely with what you had alluded to, teaching philosophy even at a young age. I know in some Scandinavian countries, they teach computer science, at least the logic, starting in the 3rd grade. So that sometimes we make these terms sound very highfalutin, very high, but the principles, sometimes kids are better at grasping these things. I know I had a professor in physics in college who said that her mother taught her calculus at 12 because she was a physicist herself, but there was no framework that you have to be a certain age to study the subject. The idea was the principles made sense and she understood it. And kind of building on your idea of, I remember Einstein was supposed to be, his family wanted him to be an engineer because they had a family business in engineering, and he ended up going in physics. And I know NPR, National Public Radio in America, had done a survey, and they found that the person who is most likely, according to the public, to be remembered 1,000 years from now is Einstein. Perhaps we wouldn't be having that conversation had he studied engineering. So everyone may have a gift, and sometimes that is what it is. There's so much more that can be said here. I think in the interest of time, we'll have to leave it at that. I want to thank you both so much for joining us and enlightening us with your insight as we began with that word enlightenment. And I think this has been an enlightening conversation. And ultimately, that is what education is all about, to enlighten and illuminate and to make us more human and understand this journey which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set us out on, to make our families, our communities, our nations, and our world ultimately a better place. Thank you to our respective guests. Thank you, Dr. Rizvi. Thank you, Haja Nawal. Thank you so much for your insights. And thank you for everything that you do for our world and making it a better place. Thank you to our audience for tuning in. And we hope to see you, inshallah, next week when we continue this conversation of how to build a virtuous community. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.